Hey everyone, it's Sweets Rose, and today I'm talking about the lawsuit that Brad Pitt has just filed against Angelina Jolie. According to Brad's complaint that he filed with the court back in 2008, he and Jolie purchased a property known as Chateau Miraval, or referred to as just Miraval, and on this property was a home and an associated vineyard. According to Brad, the intent of he and Jolie was to use the home as a private residence for the family and their children. They did enjoy holidays at Miraval. They were married there in 2014. And according to Brad, the intent was to invest in the associated vineyard and develop it into a wine business that would be a family-owned business that would also be for the long-term benefit of the family and their children. Brad's complaint states that when he and Jolie first purchased Miraval, the wine business that was existing on the property at that time was struggling. It was losing money, and over the years, he claims that he invested a significant amount of money into the wine business. He says that he invested a lot more than Angelina Jolie did, and it was disproportionate to his ownership interest. He says that he poured a lot of time, labor, and sweat equity into the wine business and has ultimately taken a struggling business and built it now into a multi-million-dollar brand. He claims that he and Angelina Jolie had an agreement where if either one of them wanted to sell his or her ownership interest in Miraval, that both parties had to consent, and that the other party would have the first option to buy the other party out. It wasn't a circumstance, according to Brad, where Angelina could just go off and sell her ownership interest in Miraval to a third party without his permission, because that would force him into doing business with a third party against his will. According to Brad's complaint, Angelina Jolie did just that. She allegedly negotiated with a third party buyer without his knowledge, without his permission, and consummated a sale to a third party of her ownership interest in Miraval, which again consists of a private family residence in the south of France and the associated vineyard, the wine business. And Brad takes issue with this and has filed a lawsuit against her, claiming that she has violated these agreements and a number of different claims that he's brought against her. So we're going to dive into the complaint and walk through it and talk about the different claims and the different facts that Brad has asserted. Brad claims that Angelina's sale of her interest in Miraval has caused a lot of damages to himself and the business because the third party purchaser, who he's now in business with, is unable to agree with him on various strategic decisions and management decisions related to the wine business. And also he says it interferes with his ability to enjoy the private residence because the home on Miraval serves as a private home for Brad Pitt. So this is causing a plethora of issues, and he has filed a lawsuit against Angelina to assert his rights. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to stay notified of all of our upcoming videos. So we're going to start out looking at the first page of the complaint. And one thing I noticed was that this complaint was filed by William B. Pitt and his LLC, Mondo Bongo, against Angelina Jolie and her LLC, Nouvelle LLC. And I didn't know that Brad Pitt's first name was William. That was interesting to me. And we start off here on page 2, where it talks about how Brad and Angelina purchased Miraval in 2008. And it comprised a home and a vineyard in the south of France. And it says that they purchased the chateau as a home to share with their children and the vineyard as a family business. And they agreed that they would never sell their respective interests in Miraval without the other's consent. So throughout the years, it says that Brad and Angelina Jolie spent the holidays at Miraval and were married there in 2014. So this is the complaint that Brad Pitt filed. Angelina Jolie will have her opportunity to file a responsive pleading, whether it be a motion to dismiss or an answer. So the Vineyard supposedly became Pitt's passion, and he developed it into a successful multi-million-dollar international business. According to Brad's complaint, at the end of last year, in October 2021, Jolie sold her interest to a third party without his knowledge, without his consent. He claims that there was a certain deceptive nature to this because she not only kept it a secret, but she had reason to know or reason to believe that the third party purchaser would seek to control the business, and therefore it would interfere with Brad Pitt's investment in the business. This third party was a Luxembourg spirits manufacturer that was controlled by a Russian oligarch named Yuri Shefler. Brad also claims that now Angelina Jolie is going to be unjustly enriched by this sale because, he supposedly poured money and sweat equity into the wine business and has built it into this multi-billion-dollar international success, whereas he claims that Angelina Jolie did not make the same amount of investment, either financially or labor-wise, into building this business. He claims that the sale was unlawful for many reasons. It breaches the agreement between them that had formed the foundation of their investment in Miraval, and that the sale deprives Brad Pitt of his right to enjoy his private home and to oversee the business that he developed from scratch. So we'll just talk briefly about the parties. The person filing this lawsuit is Brad Pitt, or William B. Pitt. Mondo Bongo LLC is his limited liability company, and Brad is the sole member of Mondo Bongo, and he holds 100% of the membership interest. This company, this LLC, was supposedly formed as a means for Brad to hold his real estate interests. Angelina Jolie is the defendant. She is the party being sued here. Her company is also being sued, Nouvelle LLC, and Brad claims that Angelina Jolie formed Nouvelle for the sole purpose of holding shares in Miraval, which was Nouvelle's only asset. So, and that Jolie held 100% of Nouvelle's ownership interest before she sold Nouvelle to the third party. So this is noteworthy in that it seems that these businesses, Mondo Bongo LLC, which was Brad Pitt's LLC, and Nouvelle LLC, which was Jolie's LLC, they seem to have this element of being formed for this, for the purposes of effectuating these real estate transaction, in terms of owning, for the purposes of owning, real estate interests. In Jolie's case, he claims that the sole purpose of her incorporating this LLC was to own her interest in Miraval. So people do this all the time for legal reasons that, are beyond the scope of this video, but there are certain reasons why people may incorporate an LLC to hold an interest in real estate or interest in property. And so it's not surprising, it's not uncommon, especially when we're dealing with very sophisticated investors or individuals who have a good amount of money, and individuals who can afford to have, legal counsel and accountants and financial advisors and people who may be instructing them on how to structure their assets and their finances. So it's not surprising to see. The reason why it's noteworthy is just to take note, because sometimes in certain jurisdictions, depending on what state you're in, there can be different rules that can govern a single member LLC versus an LLC that has more than one member. So in this case, it looks like Angelina and Brad are each the sole member of their respective LLCs. So let's talk about the facts that Brad Pitt is alleging in his complaint. And it's important to note here that we're going to be seeing a lot of like business names like Chateau Miraval SA, Quimicum SA, we've seen Novell LLC, and I'm going to try to break it down and just talk about it in like an easily understandable format. But the gist of this is that properties such as this Miraval property that has the private residence and the vineyard on it, the wine business, are oftentimes owned by business entities. And like we talked about, people do that for certain reasons. It's structured that way for certain reasons. So the way that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie purchased Miraval was by purchasing shares in a company called Quimicum SA, which was a Luxembourg public limited liability company. And it is the parent company of an entity called Chateau Miraval SA. By purchasing 100% of the shares of Quimicum, that is the way in which Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie became the owners of Miraval. So as used in this complaint, Miraval refers to both the Chateau Miraval residence where Brad and Angelina were married and its associated wine business. So we use that term to refer to both the residence and the wine business. According to Brad's complaint, both of them had this vision that Miraval would serve as a private home for the couple and their family, and that Pitt could develop its vineyard into a successful family-owned wine business for the long-term benefit of Pitt, Jolie, and their children. So I want to stop here briefly for a second and look at that paragraph that's highlighted in green, just to foreshadow something that could potentially become relevant in terms of fleshing out the narrative of the story as this litigation progresses. In this paragraph, Brad states that they had this joint vision that the home on Miraval property would be used as a private residence for the family and the children. And then it says that the joint vision, according to Brad, was that Pitt could develop the wine business into a successful venture for the long-term benefit of the family and the children. So as we've already seen at the beginning of the complaint, and as we will continue to see throughout the complaint, Brad's narrative, part of his story is that, I poured my sweat equity into this business and Angelina didn't. She became, somewhat of an absentee owner, according to him, and you'll see this later on in the complaint where he says, I attended all these meetings for various joint ventures and collaborations in building up this wine business. I was crucial to the marketing of this wine business, branding it, building it up, making the necessary connections to make it successful. And I poured not only a lot more money than she did into this business, but I also poured all of my labor into it. And she kind of just sat back and didn't do anything, where she's not really, according to him, she never really pulled her weight. But it's interesting because here, right by his own admissions, by his own statement, he says up front that the joint vision of Angelina and him was that Pitt, could develop this wine business into a successful venture for the long-term benefit of the family and the children. In terms of the narrative, I'm not sure how relevant this is going to all be in terms of the legal claims, but the narrative in your complaint, when you're filing a complaint, you're setting forth your version of the story. You're setting forth the narrative. He's trying to depict himself in a certain light, and she in her response is going to depict herself in a certain light and tell what she feels is her side of the story and her version of the facts. So we don't know, we can't know right now. We have to wait and see how the litigation progresses, or if it progresses, because she can file a motion to dismiss, to try to have the court shut down and dismiss certain of his claims or all of his claims. She can ask the court to dismiss the complaint outright in its entirety, or to dismiss certain claims. But my point is that it could affect the narrative of this. It could affect the narrative as we see the facts develop, going down the line. If Angelina Jolie does not file a motion to dismiss, or if Brad Pitt's complaint survives a motion to dismiss, or if some of his claims survive a motion to dismiss, and if the litigation therefore moves forward, Angelina will have her chance to file an answer to set forth her version of the facts. And, and then, as the litigation progresses further down the line, there's a period called a discovery period, where the parties will have the opportunity to ask each other questions. They're called interrogatories. You can send written questions to the other side that they have to answer, or send requests for production of documents where the parties can compel the other party to produce certain documents through the discovery process. There can also be depositions where the parties have to come and answer questions in person, or via, sometimes now with the pandemic, the depositions are done via Zoom. So, but basically you have to show up and you have to answer questions. You have to verbally answer questions during a deposition. And, essentially, it may come out that down the line that that there was this agreement between these parties, which Brad seems to be alluding to the fact that there was this understanding between these parties at the forefront that Angelina Jolie, that he would be the one that was actively developing the wine business. Who knows? Maybe that wasn't Angelina Jolie's forte. Maybe she didn't feel. Maybe wine was a true passion for Pitt. His complaint states that this wine business was a passion for him. And so, as any couple who's building businesses together, owning assets together, they oftentimes there is that delegation that, like, okay, we're joint owners of this, but you handle the day-to-day of that. This is your forte. This is your passion, Brad. You run with it. You handle the day-to-day, the more day-to-day management type things, the more strategic decisions, the more on the ground running things. And maybe that was their agreement. And it's interesting because it almost seems like Brad in this complaint is talking out of both sides of his mouth, because he's saying, well, she's reaping this return on investment, the return on my labors, and now she sold this business and she's getting unjustly enriched. She's getting unjust enrichment because she's getting the benefit from all the fruits of my labor. She didn't contribute her share. She didn't pour her sweat equity into this business. But then on the other side, up front in his complaint, he's saying that he seems to be suggesting strongly that there was this upfront understanding between the parties that he was going to be the one having the more active role in the wine business and developing it. And there are different ways that people invest in businesses, and there are different understandings, and that all, I think, is going to come out maybe this will all come out in the wash down the line of litigation. But there are different types of investors. Some investors take more of a passive role. We don't know right now because no facts have been developed. Nothing has been litigated. There's been no discovery. No one has had to answer any questions. No one has had to produce any documents or give full facts. But we don't know if maybe it was a circumstance where Brad was on his own volition taking the lead in developing the wine business, and possibly excluding Angelina from the day-to-day. Whether that was intentional or just a matter of practicality, because he was the one that had the expertise in this business. But we don't know what the facts are right now. So he really does focus, and a big part of his narrative here in terms of equity, because he's making some equitable arguments saying that, like, even if under the law I don't have a remedy on certain claims, as a matter of equity, the court should step in and award me XYZ. He's a big part of his equitable argument is that I poured all this, blood, sweat, and tears into it, and Angelina didn't. But, if that was their agreement, their understanding from the outset, and or if Brad was preventing her in some way or excluding her in some way from having a more active role in the business, or if she comes forth with evidence saying, no, that's not correct. I have proof. Here's my proofs of, all of these interactions that I did, or all these transactions, or all these things that I did to benefit this business and to grow this business. There's a number of ways that this story could shape out or evolve, depending on what the proofs are, and depending on, the documents that each party has to support their claims. So, but that's interesting. It's just a noteworthy point is that, on one hand, he's saying that she didn't pull her weight in the business and she's now unjustly, getting the fruits of his labor. Whereas on the other side, it seems like this may have been their understanding to begin with. According to Brad's complaint, Pitt and Jolie paid approximately 25 million euros to acquire Quimicom, that parent company. And Brad says that he contributed 60% of the purchase price and Jolie contributed the remaining 40%. We talked before about how both Angelina and Brad have LLCs through which they own real estate. So the actual structure of the transaction was that Brad's LLC, Mondo Bongo, acquired 600 shares of Quimicom, which was a 60% ownership interest in Miraval, and Nouvelle acquired 400 shares of Quimicom, Nouvelle being Angelina Jolie's LLC, which was a 40% ownership interest in Miraval. The next part of the complaint, Brad really, like I said, he really sets forth this image of all of the things that he says that he did to develop Miraval's growth and building the business. So Brad says that Miraval was in need of a lot of renovation if the vineyards were going to support a viable wine business. He said that he had been led to believe by the prior owner of the vineyard that the existing wine business on the estate could pay for itself, but that the business was actually losing money each year. And Brad claims that by 2013, in the midst of these initial renovations, Angelina supposedly stopped contributing money to Miraval altogether. So they purchased Miraval in 2008. Okay, there was the purchase price, which is one matter, where he says that he contributed 60% of the purchase price and she 40%. But then, in addition to just the money needed to purchase the property at the outset, the property, according to Brad, also required ongoing investment for renovations and fixing up the property and turning this into a viable wine business. So in addition to the purchase price, there was also the matter of what amounts of money would be invested into the business to develop, into this venture, into Miraval on an ongoing basis, to develop it into, to expand the business, to improve the business. And he claims that by 2013, Angelina had just stopped financially contributing. He claims that the parties had understood that unless he had continued to finance the development of Miraval, their plans for their family estate and family business would be derailed. So then it really goes into more detail about how Pitt was very dedicated to the project, and that he transformed the estate into a private residence for the family, and that Angelina, was willing to allow him to invest in in a manner that was far disproportionate to his relative ownership share. Brad is claiming that he contributed much more money into this property than that was disproportionate to him only having like a 60% interest in the business. He claims that he was assured that neither party could sell his or her interest without the other party's consent, and he claims that Angelina understood that. And he says that relying on that understanding, he continued to invest millions of dollars in Miraval even after she stopped investing. And he claims that he greatly enhanced the value of Miraval by completing renovations on the estate and expanding its operational capacity for the production of wine. And he claims that all in, he funded about 70% of the couple's investment in Miraval, with Jolie funding the remaining 30%. This part also struck me as being like a little bit misaligned with the overall narrative that Brad is setting forth in his complaint. According to the complaint, according to Brad, he initially started out with a 60% ownership interest in Miraval because he paid 60% of the purchase price, and Angelina Jolie started out with a 40% ownership interest in Miraval because she put forth 40% of the purchase price. So that was the purchase price being what they needed to pay up front to just get ownership of this property of Miraval. But then, he says that in terms of the ongoing investments, the financial investments that had to go into the renovations that were needed to the private residence, and also the renovations that were needed to turn this failing wine business around, he said that all in, he funded about 70% of these investments, and that she funded about 30% of these investments. And he says at multiple points in his complaint that his investments were, significantly disproportionate to his ownership interest in the business. And I realize that when we're talking about, big sums of money, we're in the multi-millions of dollars here. I understand that the difference between, say, 60% and 70% is, can be significant. That 10% difference, can be, significant sums. But it wasn't like, Brad, as the 60% owner, is claiming that he, put in 90% of the investments, or that he, funded 95%, 85%, 80%, 75%. He's saying, as a 60% owner, I funded 70% of the ongoing investments to improve this business, to improve the property, improve the business. And that Angelina Jolie, as a 40% owner, funded about 30% of the ongoing investments for these renovations. And to me, that didn't seem, in my limited opinion, because remember, we have limited facts. We don't know what dollar for dollar we're talking about here. We don't know what amounts and outlays we're actually talking about. But just, it didn't strike me as like being an obscene. It didn't strike me as being obscenely disproportionate to their ownership interest in the business. He seemed to be suggesting that, look, as a 60% owner, I was, funding well more of my share into the ongoing investments. But it didn't strike me as obscenely disproportionate. Brad concludes by this portion by saying that he would not have made these investments but for the rights that Jolie owed him. So that's also an interesting talking point. Brad is saying, I wouldn't have continued to make these investments. I wouldn't have invested, continuously in Miraval to expand the wine business and to make all these renovations that have enabled this company to grow into this multi-million-dollar success story. I wouldn't have done that, he says, if it were not for the rights that Angelina Jolie owned me. And that's an interesting statement, because on one hand, it it does make very logical sense. He's saying like, hey, if I thought that she could just go off and sell this ownership interest to a third party who I don't know and who I may not agree with and who I, can't come to terms with in terms of agreement on everyday management of the business or strategic visions for the business, I would never have continued to invest my money and my sweat equity into building up a business that ultimately I thought that I would own with a third party that I didn't agree with. But we also, in the background, we have to keep in mind that this Brad is also saying at the outset that this was my passion, this wine business. He seems to have this passion for wine and the industry. I think it's also important to remember that he owns a good amount of this business as well as an owner in this business, as an investor in this business. He has he has upside to this. He has a benefit to continuing to invest in and grow this business and make it successful. The next part of the complaint states that on March 25th, 2013, Mondo Bongo and Nouvelle converted Quimicom SA into a private limited liability company. As part of this conversion, Brad Pitt's LLC and Angelina Jolie's LLC agreed to the Quimicom Articles of Association, which is referred to as the Quimicom Articles. And these are important in this litigation. And Brad actually attaches these articles as Exhibit 1 to his complaint. And he states that this is a separate agreement from the understanding that he had with Angelina Jolie directly. And that there would be, that consent would be required, that both parties would have to consent to a transfer of ownership in the business. But he says that in addition, this separate agreement called the Quimicom Articles placed significant restrictions on the transfer of Quimicom shares by either his LLC or Angelina Jolie's LLC. So in specific, Section 543 of the Quimicom Articles prohibits the transfer of Quimicom shares inter vivos to non-shareholders without the approval of 75% of shareholders. And then he says that as a matter of Luxembourg law, this provision applies to any transfer of Mondo Bongo's or Nouvelle's shares to a third party, individual, or entity. And then he references Article 13 of the Quimicom Articles, which he says incorporates by reference a Luxembourg statute, Article 710-12 of the Law of August 10th, 1915. And he says that under this article, if a Quimicom shareholder rejects the proposed transfer of shares to a third party, the shareholder may either purchase the shares on the same terms offered to the third party or cause Quimicom to buy back the shares. In effect, the shareholder enjoys an enhanced right of first refusal. So a right of first refusal is, Brad is saying that if Angelina Jolie wants to sell this company, she has to come to him first and give him the first chance to buy it back. She can't just go off and sell it to a third party. She has to offer him first the option to purchase her share, buy her out. Since Angelina Jolie's LLC Nouvelle did not hold 75% of Quimicom, the transfer restrictions imposed an obligation on Nouvelle to first get Mondo Bongo's consent before transferring Nouvelle's shares to Quimicom to a third party. And if it could not get Mondo Bongo's consent, to offer Mondo Bongo a right of first refusal or otherwise accept a buyout from Quimicom. So then Brad states in his complaint that in December of 2013, Mondo Bongo purported to transfer 100 Quimicom shares to Nouvelle, or 10% of Quimicom. So remember, he's a 60% owner. She's a 40% owner. He's saying that in December of 2013, there was a 10% transfer of Quimicom shares to Novell, meaning that Mondo Bongo then became a 50% owner and Novell became a 50% owner. So meaning that in December of 2013, the parties were essentially equal owners of Miraval. Okay. And he's using the word purported because the validity of this transfer is being litigated currently in Luxembourg. So, that's a term that in the law is used, like purported sale, a purported transfer, because he's saying, look, I reserve my arguments that transfer was not valid. I'm reserving my arguments that transfer is not valid. We're arguing about that in a different legal proceeding that's in Luxembourg, not in this lawsuit that he filed in California Superior Court, Los Angeles County. Okay, so that's why he's using the word purported. But I would imagine that Angelina, in her responsive pleadings, is going to take the position that she is a 50% owner of Miraval, not a 40% owner, and that Brad, that they own this equally, 50-50. Now look at this part. It says in December of 2013, Mondo Bongo purported to transfer 100 Quimicom shares to Novell, or 10% of Quimicom, for the sum of €1 never paid, such that Mondo Bongo and Novell each nominally held a 50% interest in Quimicom and by extension Chateau Miraval. So he's saying, we did this transaction. She was supposed to pay me €1. She never paid it. They're disputing this transfer of whether it is valid in Luxembourg. But it's interesting because, we see this happen where, like, people, family members, people who are close to one another, have some relationship with one another, will say, I'll transfer you this for $1, and now we're seeing it as €1 because this is a Europe, we're in the south of France here. So we're talking about European proceedings. And then at paragraph 30, he says that Brad Pitt says that he would not have undertaken this separate purported transaction absent his understanding with Jolie that neither could sell his or her interest in Miraval without the other's consent and absent the transfer restrictions. He says it would have made no sense for me to contemplate giving up a majority position in Quimicom and thus Miraval if I had believed that Angelina could just go off and dispose of her ownership interest and sell Miraval to a third party without my knowledge and consent. So I just want to unpack this briefly. Brad is saying that up until this point, I was a 60% owner in the Miraval and Angelina was a 40% owner. So he says that up until this point, I was undisputably a majority shareholder. So, sometimes that's relevant, who's the majority shareholder, because sometimes, depending on how agreements are structured, depending on how different understandings are between the parties, sometimes majority shareholders can be like the deciding vote if there's a dispute between the shareholders, or they can have more say, or it can be relevant in that regard. So he's saying I would never have, entered into this transaction where I'm giving up an additional 10% of my ownership to Angelina, and I'm dropping down to a 50-50 or 50% ownership interest. He's saying I never would have given up my position as a majority shareholder in Miraval if I had thought that Angelina could just go off and sell her ownership interest in Miraval without my consent. I would never have done that if I had thought that she wasn't going to honor her obligations under the Quimicom articles, which place transfer restrictions on her ability to transfer her shares to a third party, where I have the right of first refusal and I have the first opportunity to buy her out. He also points out that Angelina Jolie is a sophisticated party like himself who brought significant independent assets into the couple's relationship. He says that the fact that she accepted this additional 10% interest in Miraval further manifested her understanding of the fact that she would need his consent before she could transfer her ownership. Okay. He's saying that, hey, look, she's a sophisticated investor. She's a sophisticated person in terms of assets and finances. And she understands that I'm giving up a majority shareholder interest, and that he says she understands what that means and the impact that that has. And therefore she understood, therefore, that I wouldn't have done that, if I had just thought that she was going to go off and sell to a third party and she wasn't going to honor her commitments. So then the next part, section E, talks about how under Pitt's direction, with all of his efforts, Miraval flourishes. So basically, Miraval has been transformed into one of the world's leading producers of rosé. He has built a struggling winery into a world-class, commercially viable producer of wine. He engaged Marc Perrin, one of France's most highly regarded winemakers, as a partner to reinvent Miraval's wine business. He says that in March of 2013, Miraval entered into a 50-50 joint venture with Marc Perrin's entity to develop a global wine business that would be associated with the Miraval estate. The joint venture is called Miraval Provence. He said that, the Miraval Rosé, which was the first wine developed by the joint venture in 2012, was an immediate success. It sold out its first 6,000 bottles online within 5 hours, and it was featured in leading wine publication. It received an award and was recognized on the top 100 of Wine Spectator's 2013 list. And he said it was the first rosé to ever appear on the list. He says that Miraval's sales grew by about 300% in 2014, with volume increasing by almost 200%, and that these bottles were flying off the shelves. He was unable to keep them in stock due to the high demand. He says that although Angelina Jolie benefited from Miraval's success, Jolie had no involvement in these efforts. And once again, that goes back to what I already previously talked about. As the litigation unfolds, perhaps we'll get some more insight as to what was their agreement on who was to take the active role in Miraval's development of the wine business. Or we may get some evidence from Angelina Jolie that she actually was involved in these efforts. So we'll see. We'll stay tuned for that. Here's where things start to take a turn. On September 19th, 2016, Angelina Jolie filed for divorce. And she initially did not seek to sell her interest in Miraval to a third party. Brad Pitt says that he continued to rely on his and Mondo Bongo's rights and continued to devote substantial attention and resources to developing the wine business and enhancing its sales. In 2017, Miraval expanded its product lines. In 2019, it launched a new brand called Studio by Miraval at a lower price point, which achieved millions of dollars in sales in its first year. So in January of 2020, Miraval began partnering with a highly regarded champagne grower. And in October of 2020, a subjoint venture established under Miraval Provence released Fleur de Miraval, the first edition of the partnership's rosé champagne. Brad Pitt says that he was integral to the effort. He attended regular meetings and had frequent correspondence with his partners, and he spearheaded the marketing campaign for all these endeavors. He again reiterates that Jolie did not participate. Then Brad says that these investments yielded, he says that these investments and efforts have yielded exceptional returns. Revenue has grown from about $3 million in 2013 to more than $50 million in 2021. He says volume has also skyrocketed, increasing by over 1,800% since Miraval first went on the rosé market in 2013. Brad says that as a result of his and his partner's efforts, the business is highly profitable, which is a big change from when he and Jolie purchased Miraval back in 2008. He says that he is, through his own significant financial investment and years of sweat equity, he has built a highly successful family-owned business, which is now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He states that Jolie did nothing to drive this growth. I want to look at these statements that he's making, which are, focusing on his efforts to build this business. He's saying, look at, everything I've done. And Angelina did nothing to drive this growth, according to him. And she allowed me to keep making these investments and devoting myself to this business. And he says, I relied on the fact that I believed that she would honor her commitments in the Quimicum articles to give me the right of first refusal before she went and sold this business. At paragraph 48, he makes a very bold statement where in my opinion, it's a very bold statement where he says, none of Miraval's success would have occurred if Pitt had not acted in reliance on these rights. And again, this goes back to what I was saying before about we have to keep it in the back of our mind that as an owner of this business, as someone who's passionate about the wine industry, is it credible for him to say that none of the success would have occurred? Like, I would not have invested at all in this business. I would not have invested, to try to make it successful if I had, believed that there was a risk of her transferring it to a third party without my consent. As an owner himself of the business, he has an incentive. He does have reason to want the business to be successful. Brad says that initially Angelina Jolie acted with an understanding of the contractual obligations, because she did engage in discussions with Pitt in 2017 about a buyout of her interest in Miraval. So, they tried, and the first effort to strike a deal didn't get very far. So in 2019, the parties resumed buyout discussions, and Pitt claims that he was prepared to buy Jolie out, either in its entirety or in part of her share at a fair price and on reasonable terms. He says that they exchanged term sheets that were focused on a partial buyout, reflecting the seriousness of the discussions. So in January 2021, Pitt says that Jolie wrote to him that she had reached a, quote, painful decision with a heavy heart. And she explained that she had purchased Miraval with Pitt as a family business and the place where she believed that they would grow old together. However, she had said that she could no longer maintain any ownership position in an alcohol-based business given her personal objections. So therefore, she said that the partial buyout that they had been discussing would not work. It was off the table. Okay. So according to Brad, Angelina then explained that she saw two ways forward. The first was an outright sale of Miraval, where both she and Pitt would jointly sell the business. And the second alternative was for Brad Pitt to completely buy her out of her share. According to Brad, this further reaffirmed that she had the same understanding as him, which was that she needed his consent in order to sell. And he says that the parties continued to engage in buyout negotiations through their representatives to be structured as a sale of Nouvelle shares in Quimicum. In an April 2020 letter, Pitt says that Jolie advised Pitt through her counsel that she recognized that she would have to remain in the business if the parties could not execute a deal. And Pitt says that the negotiations progressed to a very advanced stage. and the parties then reached an agreement on price. He then says that in a letter dated June 15th, 2021, Jolie's representatives abruptly informed him that they were terminating discussions and accused him of having no intent of finalizing an agreement. He says that Jolie's letter concluded by saying, "We consider ourselves free from any negotiations with you and free to pursue any other transactions that we would deem appropriate to undertake." He says that then Angelina Jolie, on June 30th, 2021, Jolie advised the divorce court that she had reached terms with a third-party buyer. All right, so this is he says he kind of positions this as a very quick turnaround. He says, we were negotiating, we were at a very high end stage of our negotiations. But then she sent me this abrupt letter on June 15th, and by June 30th, she advised the divorce court that she had another buyer. Brad says that he intended to confront any prospective third-party buyer with him and his LLC's rights in the course of its due diligence process, but no one affiliated with this third-party buyer ever contacted him or his company prior to the announcement of the sale. Brad says that Jolie's unnamed buyer was Tenute del Mondo, a subsidiary of Stoli Group, which itself is controlled by Russian oligarch Yuri Shefler. They said that the third-party buyer issued a press release on October 5th, 2021, announcing that it had purchased Angelina Jolie's stake in Miraval. And Pitt says this was the first time that he or anyone associated with him had learned that Tenute del Mondo was even in discussions to buy Miraval. He says that he had been expecting Jolie and Nouvelle to honor their contractual obligations before consummating any third-party sale, and that he was very shocked by the announcement of the sale. He said that if Jolie had honored her contractual obligations and given him the opportunity to buy her out, then Pitt would not have consented to the sale. And that if this is allowed to continue and allowed to stand, if this sale is allowed to stand, it will deprive Pitt of his right to enjoy his private home and to secure his position in the business he built from scratch for the long-term benefit of his family. Then, interestingly, Brad Pitt claims that there was a certain amount of deception from Angelina Jolie, not only because she kept the sale private and didn't honor her commitments in giving him the first opportunity to buy, to match the terms of the sale, okay, and buy her out. So then he says that she structured this sale in a way that was deceptive, that would allow her to circumvent the terms of the contract between him and her. So he said that the language of the Quimicum articles expressly prohibited Angelina Jolie from selling Nouvelle's shares in Quimicum. Remember, Nouvelle owned shares in Quimicum, which is the parent company, which is the parent entity that owned Miraval. Okay, so we talked about that at the beginning. So the Quimicum articles were phrased by saying that the parties are prohibited from selling their shares in Quimicum. So Angelina then sold Nouvelle itself to the third-party buyer. She just sold the whole LLC to him. And in effect, that did the same thing. It transferred her ownership of Miraval. He says that if Nouvelle had sought Mondo Bongo's consent to the purported ownership change, then Mondo Bongo would not have granted it and would have exercised its right of first refusal. All right, so there's a lot to unpack here, and it's important. So what happened is that, supposedly, according to Brad, Angelina and him were negotiating, and they got pretty far in their negotiations for him to buy her out. They even supposedly had decided on a price, but then she, according to him, she abruptly let him know that, I consider myself free of my obligations to negotiate with you, and I, am not going to be continuing our discussions. And then very quickly after, there was an announcement that she had actually sold to this third party that is owned by Yuri Steffler. So that under the language of the Quimicum articles, this contract between him and Jolie, it forbid the parties from selling their shares of Quimicum. Because remember, when they purchased Miraval, they did so by purchasing shares in the parent company, Quimicum. So he started out being a 60% owner and she a 40% owner of Quimicum shares. And that's how they indirectly owned Miraval, which is this property that was owned by Quimicum, right? So she couldn't sell her shares of Quimicum. So what she did, according to Brad, is she sold Nouvelle, the holding LLC, her LLC that held these shares. It was the only asset of her LLC, was these Quimicum shares. She sold the whole LLC. And, you know, her argument, we'll see what her argument is in the response when she files her responsive papers. But, you know, her argument might be that, hey, look, nothing prohibited me from selling my company. I can sell my LLC. There's nothing in the express language of the Quimicum articles that prohibits me from doing so. Or, you know, she might take another position by saying that I did actually engage in good faith discussions for Brad Pitt, with Brad Pitt, for him to buy out my share. Like, she might say, I did fulfill my obligations. I did, you know, offer him the opportunity first to buy me out. And and remember, these negotiations, by Brad Pitt's own admissions in his complaint, these negotiations went on for quite some time. Like, he says that they were negotiating for years. But, you know, so she maybe is going to take the path, we'll wait and see. She might take the path of saying, I did negotiate with him. I did give him the opportunity to buy from me first. We just couldn't get there. We couldn't get to the agreement. Maybe, who knows, depending on what the details of these negotiations are, you know, maybe she did offer Brad the same terms that were offered to, or the same terms through which the third party purchaser actually purchased the transaction. Maybe she did offer the same terms, or maybe she and Brad were discussing, you know, the same terms as the ultimate purchase terms between her and the third party. But maybe there were certain pieces of that Brad didn't agree with. Because remember, according to Brad, the way that the right of first refusal worked was that she had to offer him the same terms, the same buyout terms as the third party purchaser. So maybe he didn't agree to those terms. Maybe she did offer him those terms. Maybe that was part of her discussions with Brad and her negotiations with Brad, but he did not agree to those terms. You know, depending on how these facts flesh out. Remember, we're speculating here. We're going off of very incomplete facts. All we have right now is a complaint from Brad Pitt. But if it turns out that she, you know, maybe those terms, maybe her negotiations with Brad Pitt were along the same lines as her negotiations with the other company, and that she did give him that option to buy at those terms, then, you know, maybe she'll say, well, hey, look, I satisfied that obligation. He was being completely unreasonable throughout these negotiations. Which is what her letter supposedly stated, which is that he didn't really have a good faith intent to finalize these agreements. So I've been negotiating with, maybe her position will be, I've been negotiating with this guy for years, and he was just unwilling to finalize an agreement. So we don't know what those facts are. But essentially, it's also important to note that, going back to how she actually ended up selling her interest in Miraval, by selling her whole company, Nouvelle LLC, in effect, that is selling her interest in Miraval. It's doing the same thing as if she sold the Quimicum shares as a practical matter, because the Quimicum shares were the only asset of the Nouvelle LLC. So Brad's point is like, hey, she structured it in a certain way to evade the language of our contract, but in reality, she's doing the exact same thing. She's forcing me into business with a third party, which I don't agree to being in business with. I don't consent to this transfer. So he is pretty much kind of saying, hey, this was pretty slimy. There was an element of deception in this, is what he's trying to get across. There's also a good turn on whether a question of, was it just poor drafting? Was it, because remember, when you're drafting a contract, you want to have an ironclad contract where it contemplates all contingencies, and it basically forecloses and prohibits all different ways that someone could, circumvent and get around the language of the contract. So there's not a question of like, was this poor drafting? Maybe there should have been a provision that said, that specifically spoke to the selling of Nouvelle LLC. You can't prohibiting Angelina or prohibiting Brad from actually selling their limited liability companies that hold the shares of Quimicom, that give them ownership to Miraval. So, that's a whole nother issue. Another point is that I think that depending on how the facts shake out, depending on what proofs are set forward, she might have an argument that she gave him the right of first refusal. I think that her problem comes in with section 5.4.3 of the Quimicom articles, where it does state that the parties need one another's consent before transferring the shares. I think that's the bigger problem, is that if she truly did keep this other deal in a shroud of secrecy and didn't present that to him and just surprise him with this sale, I think that's going to be the crux of the issue. And I think that's his stronger argument, because that's an express statement within the contract. According to Brad, this third party that Angelina sold her share of the company, her share of Miraval to, absent his consent, is actually an aggressive third-party competitor in the industry. And he says that ever since Angelina Jolie's LLC has come under Yuri Scheffler's control, Brad Pitt and this purchaser have been unable to agree on the management and strategic direction of Quimicom. And they've been deadlocked on things that are pretty basic. So he's saying it's impeding my ability to run the day-to-day operations of this business. He says that Nouvelle has sought to seize operational control of the wine business and has contacted Miraval's distributors to discuss contract terms without his authority and without Miraval's knowledge or consent. And that this third-party purchaser is seeking to transfer Miraval's intellectual property to Cyprus as part of an unsound and legally questionable tax strategy, and has demanded that Chateau Miraval's bank freeze its assets. So essentially, there's a lot of problems between Brad Pitt and this new purchaser. They're not in agreement. He claims that this new purchaser is being difficult, doing shady things, and it's highly problematic, and that Angelina Jolie, therefore, has damaged him and the business substantially by engaging in this illegal sale of the company. He says that both he and Angelina Jolie understood that neither could or would sell his or her stake in Miraval to anyone without the other's knowledge and permission, and he would not have devoted substantial time, attention, and resources to Miraval in the absence of that agreement. Okay, so then he brings a number of claims against Angelina Jolie for tortious interference with contractual relations, saying she intentionally engaged in actions that were designed to induce a disruption of Mongo Bongo's contractual relationships with Nouvelle and Quimicom. He says that Angelina Jolie was unjustly enriched by the fruits of my efforts. So the second claim is for breach of implied in fact contract. The third claim for relief is breach of quasi-contract. The fourth claim he brings is for breach of implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. And his fifth claim for relief is constructive trust. He's saying that Once again, she was unjustly enriched, and as a result of the wrongful transfer of her ownership, Nouvelle, her LLC, has become an involuntary trustee of its Quimicum shares for the benefit of him and his LLC. And then he requests, the standard request for relief here. This case is at such an early stage, we'll just have to wait and see how things progress. Check out these other videos and subscribe to our channel to stay notified of our upcoming videos.